MES Marampally, e-learning.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you to the Department of English, MES College, for inviting me to speak about post-theory. I will be talking about the idea of theory first and how theory slowly but definitely changed into this concept of post-theory and the multiple levels of understanding this idea of post. The concept of whether we are over theory or whether we're just in a new stage of theoretical analysis of a given literary text. So let me first explain what theory is, and as we all know, literary criticism slowly changed into literary theory during the time of structuralism, and structuralism as well as post-structuralism pay a lot of detail on language and the idea of language as being ambiguous, ambivalent and very slippery emerged during the time of the post-structuralist thinkers.
All writing and all reading is political, and literary theory gives us an idea of the political dimensions of what is being written, how it is being published, and how it is being read, because no two texts are the same. We know that. I will come to the idea of the original concept of the author and the reader, but if you look at it, you can never read the same text twice, because you keep changing. Okay, the text might be there in the concrete form, but you keep changing. Not only that, no two people can ever read the same text in the same manner. So these are the ideas that literature has given us. So theory thrives in modern academy by taking life from multiple sources, from common sense, from objectivity, from intelligibility, from science, from physics. So I would start off by talking about the concept of structuralism, where language is only a convention, a system of differences. And the post-structuralist conclusion that meaning, truth, human nature, individual subjectivity, authorship, authority, these are all conventions. Nothing is natural. And I think that is where post-structuralism comes into its own, where we challenge everything that has been accepted as given, as natural, as permanent. And we understand that whether it is individual subjectivity or authorship, these are local bourgeoisie conventions. And theory promised, that was a great promise that post-structuralism gave us, that we will challenge this all and offer a liberatory way to break and remake the conventional and the traditional. The success of theory was achieved. Why was theory successful? What made people imagine that this concept of the post-structuralism would succeed is that the stakes of literature had dropped. All right. If you look at the evolution of education, you will see how humanities and the soft studies sort of gave way to the hard sciences. And especially since the Cold War, humanities and literature particularly became a secondary, a soft discipline. And it was felt that its judgments were very subjective and appeal was narrowly elite. So in the structuralist space, you find that everything becomes objective. Everything becomes scientific, and we say that structuralist the poetics of structuralism is a disinterested science. It moves away from the reading of individual texts to the idea of a basic grammar of literature itself. If you remember Vladimir Propp and Fry and all these people, they were trying to contain diverse texts of literature within a framework which completely did away with this idea of the original author. The veneration of people like Shakespeare and Chaucer, when we spoke about Shakespeare being universal, Shakespeare being for all time, they were trying to sort of categorize Shakespeare, bring a very objective concept, thereby making literature or the study of literature seem to be not subjective anymore, but a very disinterested exploration based on science. Now, in the post-structural phase, it claimed the authority of a committed politics. And like Terry Eagleton said, it is commitment towards politics from another means, by another means. So if post-structuralism sort of dismantled all your ideas of preconceived notions about ideology, it was presenting politics in a completely different manner. So what did theory set out to do? Theory set out to destroy Western concept of rationality, and it sort of proposed that it would embrace a liberatory political practice. But all these things, though you find certain glimmers of all this, it didn't really take off in the way it was expected. So, the death of the author was categorically stated. But authorial intention since has been recognized as only one of the multiple contradictory intentions in the text productions. All right, so the control of the author was taken away, and what the author intended or what the author meant became only one strand of the multiple ways in which a text could be read. And there's a big question that you have to raise here. Now, who is the author that Roland Barthes killed? Roland Barthes kills the liberal humanist concept of the author. When the author is a very, is an originator of all that he writes. From there, we move on to the idea where the author becomes a receptacle, where he collects ideas from multiple sources and puts it together in a particular format. So, theory, as has often been accused, can complicate and contest the categories of analysis. But the clarification and correction of these categories, the necessary specification of processes, can only come through theoretical scholarship, particularly only if you bring in the idea of language as well as the concept of history, sociology, as well as politics into it, to name a few disciplines. So if we take as serious the now standard theoretical claim about the limitations of authorial intention, a proper response must shift the investigation to a materialist mode rather than a linguistic mode. So the material production of a text also has to be taken cognizance of. Now, there are certain questions at this stage that we have to ask ourselves when we deal with post-structuralism. Have we been theoretical enough? That's number one. Next is, what is the relation between theory, or perhaps you could call it post-theory, with culture and criticism? How can it be re-articulated today? What is the articulation, the implication of post-theory for the relationship between culture and politics? And is there anything new to be read? Well, this is a great question, a hugely traumatizing question as far as writers are concerned. What is new? Everything has already been said many times over. So how do you make it new, or have we sort of exhausted ourselves at the end of time, or the end of literature, the literature of exhaustion, as it has been variously called? So let's look at now that was just an introduction to what we had understood by the term theory, or the concept of structuralism and post-structuralism, which foregrounds the ambiguity and the ambivalence of language. Now, using the very same tools of linguistic analysis, let us look at the term post-theory. I'm sure all of you have heard of post-colonialism, right? And the prefix called post. So post always means something which comes after. The problem is that the word after can also be read as a verb. Adverb. I ran behind somebody, right? So that is also going after. So post-theory could mean that you still haven't let go of the basic concepts of theory, therefore the remnants, the memory of what it was, what theory was, is still there very strongly within the concept of post-theory. Just like post-colonialism, the idea of the colonial empire, the idea of life lived within the imperial regime is very clearly present within the concept of post-colonial. So there were many critics who felt that theory is dead, the doxa is dead, we don't need it anymore, and reading should be very simplistic, reading should be not political, and they were very keen to announce the death of theory. So that is a very facile and improbable sense of a condition. So it is not, post-theory doesn't mean that the period of theory is over, it doesn't mean that we have overcome theory as if it is a disease, or neither is it a condition where we are without theory. So these are not what post-theory is. So first of all, the theory's task is in theorizing its own institutionalization and internationalization. I would like to explain this. Number one, Theory's task is to hold a mirror up to itself. If theory sets out to, for example, deconstruction, if deconstruction set out to dismantle most of the codes of what we had thought were natural, and it sort of demolished all meta-narratives, what became very strong was theory itself as a meta-narrative. That is the institutionalization of theory. And secondly, the internationalization of theory. I began with Edward Said, and Edward Said talks about traveling theory. But if you look at it, let's take the example of perhaps post-colonialism or feminism. Now, internationalization of these theories, let's look at the political ramifications of it. So post-colonialism, if you look at it, is a bootstrap term. Bootstrap, I mean you bring in multiple experiences, like bringing the colonial experience of Africa, India, Sri Lanka, you have settler colonies like Australia and America, you put it all together and you just call it a post-colonial experience. That is what is called internationalization, the term where the local context is made invisible. In post-theory, it is a geolocal context which gains supremacy because it is our idea or our understanding or our application of a particular idea to our own concepts, our own lived life experiences that makes any sort of thinking organic thinking. Another great example you can get from feminism. For a long time, feminism is a translated term, and they're following the dictates of white women. Kate Millett has said that, or Simone de Beauvoir has said that. The problem is, Simone de Beauvoir has not lived the life a woman in Kerala does. Kate Millett has not experienced the sexual politics you and I have experienced. So therefore, we take Kate Millett or we take Simone de Beauvoir and we have to reinvent them in our own geolocal context, in our own real life lived experiences. And this is where the idea of theory as an institution which cannot be touched, which is rather like, religion where the dictums are very clear and very straight. Everybody follows the same thing, the uniformity that certain dictums ask you to do. This is what is being dismantled within the framework of theory. The theory is now using the optics that it looked to survey the world outside, turning it into itself, and theory is looking at itself in the mirror. Okay? So, theorist's task is in theorizing its own institutionalization and internationalization. And secondly, it envisages a critical return upon the excluded others in theory. That is, a theory yet to come. So it's not that we are finished with theory, we are futuristic, we are looking forward to something that is evolving, something that will revitalize the institutionalized, established ideas that we have so far depended upon to read and understand literary text or any sort of text. So the reflexive problem on how to do theory is full awareness of its white, patriarchal Western cultural origins. And this was first posed in the 1980s. So you could say that the post-theory, the beginnings of post-theory can be found in Derrida himself, when he sort of questions himself and the idea of the entire Western metaphysics and using the language given by the institution to question the institution itself. So when you look at sort of approach the concept of theory or the established institutionalized, internationalized theory, these are the few questions which are being raised. There is an aporia or self-questioning of theory which has been enlivened. The double bind which exists within theory itself. Like I told you, for example, post-colonialism or feminism. And it has been made more appealing to contemporary intellectual sensibilities, I quote, by a large pinch of post-Derridian philosophical spice. So again, post-Derridian, where you cannot actually get away from Derrida. You're still there, but you have sort of used Derrida and you're now looking at several other ideas by self-reflexivity also. You glance at the tools of analysis that you're using as well as what you are looking at. I hope this is clear. What I mean to say is that you never imagine that the text is subjective and the tools of analysis that you use are very objective. The theory is very sort of there and sacrosanct and cannot be touched. We have to look at theory itself. We have to look at the, I keep reading these comments and that sort of distracts me, sorry. the revitalization of theory begins with questioning the basic concepts of theory itself. So, and the problem with structuralism and later with post-structuralism was that their language became very technical and specialized. There was a joke which said that if you don't understand them, just agree with them. You don't understand half of what Derrida has said, just agree with what Derrida has said, because Derrida definitely knows more than you. And you feel that you're beaten into submission because, of the 5-syllable words that theory just drops at, like name dropping, 5-syllable words are dropped at you. And theory became notorious for its esotericism. Becomes very esoteric, goes above your head, but you have to pretend that you understand theory. And this allegation was not totally unfounded. But as Eagleton and many others pointed out, you have to remember that early theoretical work emerged from an intimate dialogue with grassroots radicalism that happened in 1960 in Paris, a great movement. If you Google, you'll find out, okay? So when we think of theory as very abstract, as very esoteric, we forget the roots of theory itself, because theory began with a very strong activist-oriented idea, where theory was engaging with this movement in the 1960s in Paris. So, we have Roland Barthes, who gave us a particular, like Virginia Woolf said, today modernism is born and everything else is dead. We have a very clear idea when an author is dead, a particular date when Roland Barthes said. But remember that the death of the author didn't begin with Roland Barthes. If you look at the Indian context, or if you look at any context, you will understand that the author was never original source of our meaning. Because if you look at the stories of Valmiki or Kalidasa, we will clearly understand that. They were just receptacles. Divine muses were descending into them, and they were conduits giving you God's word. So this is the basic idea of the author, which was with a very political perspective that Roland Barthes problematized later. So let's not get confused with the origin and the beginning. So there are many opinions regarding when exactly theory or the esoteric theory died. There are a couple of incidents which are very interesting, and one is that in 1987, after Paul Diman died, who was one of the major post-structuralists, it was found that he had written for a Nazi newspaper during the Second World War, and there were several allegations of Paul Diman being anti-Semitic, and this was felt as a betrayal by the left academic establishment. So there were many people, including Derrida, who came up to defend Paul Diman, but this lingered. Okay, this man has said something, but he has done something else also. The basic idea of ambiguity. The next major blow, this was a really major blow in 1996, when a physicist called Alan Sokal, he submitted a hoax article, a pseudo article, to a very prominent humanities journal. And Sokal argued that established concepts are nothing but ideological constructs, and he presented several pages of jargon-laden referential nonsense as evidence. It meant absolutely nothing. So he was just pulling a fast one on us, and he said, this is all you're doing, the humanities scholars, in spite of your alleged pretensions to be scientific, you're just putting together multiple words which mean nothing, and I can prove it to you. And he submitted a nonsense article to a very prominent journal, and the article was accepted. So after its acceptance, he publicly announced that he had fooled us, all right? And Sokal touched a firestorm of debate about scientific authority, and he became a hero for the anti-postmodernists. It wasn't exactly a fatal blow for theory, but Sokal's stunt, this particular mischief, shook a humanities academy that had been resting on its lot of complacency into which humanities had entered, was severely shaken up by Alan Sokal. So you come into this area of what it means to have entered this era of post-theory. So you look at it, it privileges the text, the inclusion of virtual all cultural formation of the category of text. All right, so like I said, it doesn't need to be printed, it can be a virtual text. It need be written at all, it can be a performance, it can be a painting, it can be an installation, it can be an SMS message, it can be an advertisement, it can be anything. So this revitalization of the text or the understanding of the text. So language is still fundamental, and we'll always use language in ways that aren't very logical or have scientific explanation. And the use of language will continue to ramify the way in which we understand ourselves as human beings in the world. And that is where we actually have to move on to what is known as post-humanism. But I will do that a little later. So if that is the case, if we still take recourse to language, if we still talk about the idea of understanding ourselves in terms of language, we can never be free of what is known as theory. So Zizek speaks about the idea of post-theory in connection with film studies, and he says that post-theoretical, the concept of post-theoretical is indicative of a very deep crisis within humanities scholarship. So he says, I quote from Zizek, the antagonism between theory and post-theory is a global battle for intellectual hegemony between postmodern, deconstructive studies on one hand and cognitivists and popular science, popularizers of hard sciences on the other. So this is where Zizek sees the concept of post-theory. So if you look at it, theory has been central to a kind of everyday knowledge. Whatever you do, like you have Butler who sort of talks of gender as a performance, your everyday, you have Guy Debord, you have Foucault, your Stuart Hall who spoke about the everyday. And therefore, theory has become a sort of everyday knowledge, and theory becomes disseminated as new thought. And the question of how to theorize in the popular emerges as an important icon. And you have cultural studies here and new historicism, which sort of used Derridian concepts of deconstruction as well as Marxian ideas to reread texts. So that is the next stage in the movement from post-structuralism. You come into the area of cultural studies. And here you have this great framework, a larger framework, called post-theory, and from there you sort of challenge or you sort of rethinking many theories that we had initially studied, initially internalized. And you must remember that theory always wants to be radical. Theory doesn't want to be institutionalized, or theory doesn't want to remain as established. Theory was always trying to challenge, and theory has created a precondition of its own existence. It is a wished for political activism. So theory, or whether it is post-theory or theory, it challenges institutional norms and canonical authority, where their effects are most assuredly determined. And within the concept of post-theory, you find theory challenging itself. It holds a mirror up to itself. So theory cannot afford to ignore its own consecration. You sort of place theory on a pedestal and say, this cannot be touched. We are perhaps at a stage where its very preeminence, the preeminence of theory, has opened up real concerns of how it must proceed. So again, there is no getting away from theory. It is just revitalizing theory. So theory has to protect itself from becoming a doxa, the very state that it set out to subvert. And this is where a sociological examination of states of theory might be helpful to reconfirm theory's disruptive potential. So, I'll just quote from Derrida, the time for reflection is also a chance to turn back on the very conditions of reflection in all the senses of the world. Look at the words that he has used. With the help of a new optical device, you could not only view the city and the landscape, but you could view viewing. You could see the technique used for seeing itself. So that is very crucial, because now you cannot remain out of the text. For example, let me tell you, if I were reading Jane Austen, I cannot say that I'm reading Jane Austen from a post-colonial point of view, and that is there, which is very scientific, it is very objective, I am nowhere in the picture. No, I have to bring myself, embed myself in the text, because my experience as a woman in Kerala, my experience as a wife, my experience as a teacher would definitely color my reading of Jane Austen's text. So the optical device, the sight that has been used to view the text itself is subject to close scrutiny and examination. Therefore, when we once prided ourselves on scientific observation, we now have to tell ourselves that even within science, the way in which something is looked at is as important as what is looked at. Because if you know physics, you will clearly understand what I'm trying to say. Things existing as both particle and waves, and the optical devices that are used to look at this, they themselves have to be put under scrutiny. So, yeah, post theory rejects a self-satisfied hypostatic theory, a theory which is in love with itself. So these are things which post theory reject. It rejects the hardening of theory's lexical and syntactical structures. The words and phrases are combined in familiar ways and banalized, degraded, wielded like a fetish. So if you remember, the Shakespearean puns, which later became so much cliche that we had to sort of revitalize that. In much the same way, the cliches used by theory have to be revitalized by bringing them into a more localized context. So, the everyday realm, now you move from the great meta-narratives into the everyday life, the minor lives of people, like you have Deleuze and Guattari, who have written extensively on minor literature, not minority literature, but minor literature. It is a very interesting area. So everyday realm is understood to be a repository of theoretical knowledges and increasingly allows everyday subjects to make fuller sense of the complex object terrains and social relations that constitute their world. So before moving further, I would like to just bring in the idea of feminism here, which is rather easy to understand so that you will get what I'm trying to say. So when you think about post-feminism, this is just one of the posts that I'll be talking about. I brought it in early because I wanted to get a few examples. So post-feminism has been interpreted in three ways, okay? The first interpretation is an epistemological change from previous practices of feminism as Anglo-centric and hegemonic, it becomes hegemonic, to a reconceptualized and more inclusive version of feminism. Second understanding of post-feminism is that a historical shift in the feminist movement, individualizing feminism, constructing it as a movement for personal choices as opposed to past feminist movements surrounding overarching social change. Third version is rather dangerous, and it is a backlash against feminism, and it tells you that we have already achieved post-independence. Like they say post-independence, they say that, okay, feminism is already achieved. All women are equal to men. And now the women, the so-called feminists, can hear their biological clocks ticking away, and they have to go back inside their houses, get married, cook, have children. That is another way of looking at post-feminism. And Susan Faludi has written extensively on this backlash concept of post-feminism. I would like to rather focus on the idea of dismantling the hegemony of Anglo-centric feminist narratives and looking at basic local narratives. For example, I think Margaret Atwood, a Canadian author, has beautifully put this. She says that I became a feminist not because I wanted to join another army with another set of rules. You break away from patriarchy because patriarchy gives you a very clear set of rules, a rule set that you have to follow. But breaking away from patriarchy and you become a feminist, you have the feminist Bible giving you another doxa, another set of rules. So these are the things that you must do. And Atwood very humorously says that, well, I want to wax my legs, I want to do my eyebrows, I want to be pretty, but feminists will not allow me to do this. So where do you realize yourself? That is the great question that is being asked. So it is all right if you don't agree with Kate Millett. You can have your own idea of what it is to be a woman, how you sort of articulate yourself, and the space in which you articulate this becomes extremely crucial in your understanding of the term feminism. I don't know how many of you know Malayalam here, but feminism has been interpreted in two ways in Kerala. One is, they call it Stri Shaktigaranam, which means women empowerment. So when you call it women empowerment, it is rather as if a woman has to be propped up. Plant a sapling and you help it to grow by supporting it. So it's as if something has to support us. But the moment a woman sort of steps out of this, she gets a job, fine. She does her thing, but the moment she takes claim of her own body, the moment she becomes a sexually desiring subject, that is the moment the empowerment discourse shifts and the slut shaming begins. And I think the social media in Kerala has coined a particular word called femininity. That has other political connotations as well, which means that's exactly slut shaming. And that is where the discourse of feminism stops in certain cultures. So here I would like to talk about a very, very simple example of what it is to be part of commodity feminism, not commodity fetishism, but commodity feminism. And commodity feminism, if you look at it, has to be studied from a very regional point of view, very not an institutional point of view, but rather a very local point of view. And one example, like what is commodity feminism? It is appropriating of feminist beliefs for capitalist purposes. And it is being largely used by advertising agencies. So if you look at certain women's magazines, I don't want to name those magazines, there are women's magazines in English as well. If you look at those magazines and you look at the advertisements given in those magazines, what are the types of advertisements that are given? If you have attempt a real, page by page statistical analysis, you will find that more than 60% of the book magazine is filled with advertisements. And what do they advertise? You must remember that the woman is being targeted. And what are we supposed to buy, or what are we supposed to have the intelligence to buy? Saris, clothes, lipsticks, makeup, accessories, or cooking vessels, or at the curry powders. Do they advertise a car? Well, I earn money as much as my partner does. Why can't I buy a car? Why can't I make a decision? No, they will not allow me to get a choice to buy a car because that is somewhere beyond my reach. So that is where commodity feminism comes in. And very clearly, they're using feminist values like a woman. Look at her. She is working as a working woman. The idea of working woman as, again, very, very problematic. As a woman who sits inside the house doesn't work. So that is unpaid labor. This is why I'm telling you that if you use these concepts which are in Kerala, you will not be able to understand. You sort of form a an institutionalized discourse. This will not be applicable to women living in many other countries. So what we have to do is we have to use the basic ideas and restructure them, reinvent them, and then revitalize this particular doxa. Okay, so these interpellations are very enigmatic in nature, but they exert a very decisive influence on the development of the subject's most intimate desires and aspirations. So this is where we sort of make it real and we make it relevant for us. So again, I would like to talk about reading using the strategies of post-theory. Just one brief example for how you read Shakespeare. For a long time, character analysis was, the Bradleians and Neo-Bradleians were doing what, they acted as if Hamlet was real and Macbeth was real, and you're trying to do a very deep character analysis. And you talk about inadequacies of Desdemona's personality, or the failure of Isabella to know herself sexually, as if they were real people. So this character study was being challenged by post-structuralist theory, and character study became an inappropriate mode of analysis. So the question, Barth's question, who's speaking? Like I told you, the liberal humanist concept to construct in relation to any Shakespearean speech prefix an imaginary fullness. So that's why Katherine Hayes says that, what is character? That is where this revitalizing or the restructuring happens. What is recognized in our culture as character must be the effect of the entire culture and a point of intersection of a range of discourses. So this is how Shakespeare is read from a new historicist point of view, or like we would call it from a post-theory point of view, which would bring in multiple dimensions of reading. Character, you look at character, but when you look at character, look at the culture which produces this particular character. Look at the discourses available at that time, which goes into the creation of Hamlet or the creation of Macbeth, and that is where, and you look at Hamlet, who's probably or is the point at which multiple discourses are coming together, meshing together and forming a plateau there. And it is from this perspective that you look at Hamlet. And therefore, the basic question that you ask is, what was Hamlet at the age of 30 doing in a university? All right, because kings would probably bring their sons and groom them as heir apparents. So this is the way in which character or the idea of Shakespearean text is studied, by firmly placing it within the Elizabethan milieu and looking at how this has been translated into various cultures. And therefore we would have to very, very categorically state that Shakespeare is very much of his own space, very much of his own time, and there is nothing universal about him. His idea about love, his idea about women, his idea about beauty, his idea about nationalism is very British, or what Britain was at that point of time. So, like Belsey, Katherine Belsey, a very important critic, has said, it was feminism alongside Marxism that played the greatest role in unmasking the institutionalization and the hegemonizing ideas of theory. So Kate Millett, and she speaks about Miller and Naylor and D.H. Lawrence, and she was bringing a very important idea of patriarchy at play here. Yeah, so I spoke about post-feminism, and I would like to move on into, I'm sorry I'm getting distracted here with the comments. I would like to move into this idea of post-truth. Okay, I'm not going deeply into this. Post-truth, when we look at the word post-truth, if we believe that we are living now in a world which can be defined as a post-truth era, then it means that earlier there was a truth era and a pre-truth era. All right? So we were speaking the truth earlier, but now somehow with media and technology, we are emerging as species of post-truth species. Is that right? This is the basic thing that we would like to challenge here, because whoever uses language deals with the realm of post-truth. Language has always been used to sort of engage with imaginations, engage with what is not, engage with what is unreal. And therefore, from the time we started using language, we have been dealing with the concept of post-truth. So, and here you have, within this area of post-truth, there is this great anxiety of truth claims, authority to become a legitimate public truth teller. So that is where the problem begins. You look at the authority and you feel that any sort of fact that they tell you is true. And if it doesn't come from them, it is untrue. It is like, rather like seeing is believing. And you have a number of people taking pictures, playing around with it, and then that's where the new media comes in. And therefore seeing doesn't become believing at all. Now look at the selfies that you take. All right. How much do our selfies resemble ourselves? A selfie is exactly what we want to look like, and with the help of new media technology, we can edit ourselves into any desired shape within certain existing norms, of course. So, right. Post-truth pertains to two different but very related forms of truth. Honesty on one hand and facts on the other hand, because honesty is based on an individual value system and scientific facts are completely different. So post-truth represents definitional problems like other grand periodizing concepts, like I told you, modernity. This is where modernity begins and this is where it ends. This is what postmodernism is, starting date and ending date. But then where do you place Tristram Shandy then? So there are certain events which pop up which completely shatters your efforts to periodize these ideas. And sometimes post-truth is interpreted as a time beyond or without truth. Okay, if you remember Baudrillard and his idea of spectacle, this clearly resonates with your concept of post-truth. And The Gulf War did not happen, did the series of essays that he wrote. The spectacle, the social life and subjectivity had been consumed by techno-consumerist flood of images and simulations and hyper-reality more than reality. So this is where Baudrillard's position becomes crucial. He says, illusion is fundamental rule. Illusion is the fundamental rule, and that resonates with post-truth. So you have more things coming in. So Baudrillard stops with this idea of spectacle, but now you have more ideas coming in. One is competing trust. Who do you trust more? Which authority do you trust more? Look like newspapers. If you remember, if you look at the newspapers that we read, this paper has said this, but what about the other paper? What is their take on the same subject? So you have competing truths, authority, bias, political polarization, and again, very importantly, algorithmically customized experiences. So here you enter from a world, we were speaking about the age of information. From the age of information, very slowly, not slowly, rather quickly, but very subtly, we have entered the age of experience, where we ourselves are embedded in this concept of creating information. So this is a term which is being used constantly, is information ecology. As far as post-truth is concerned, let us look at the multiple other dimensions that come in within post-truth, because post-truth has been read as something which is media generated, largely dependent on technology. So let us look at information ecology. So it's an ecosystem. The information system is an ecosystem. The digital communication infrastructure is oriented towards profit instead of dissemination of factual information. And that is very crucial. The profit making, that is why online classes become a huge burden for people, because information becomes categorically controlled and money becomes a controlling factor. So, and this ecology is built for speed and constant individual movement and attention shifting. You move from platform to platform, you move from screen to screen, you interchange between WhatsApp and many other things. So this is what is happening. And research suggests it has an impact on perception, interest, and temporal reasoning. And knowledge tech focused cognitive scientists are beginning to argue that the techno-economic structure has effects on reasoning, long-term memory, and thus knowledge acquisition. So here, I don't think I will have time to go deeply into the memory study. So I would just like to make a point here. We talk about technology having an impact on long-term memory. This works in two ways. One is that due to technology, we can store n number of memories in digital platforms. But technology also facilitates short-term memories, because you're inundated with pictures, you're inundated with statistics, with numbers, with words, so that the ability of the brain to retain memory becomes very limited. So your idea of what it is to remember is challenged here. Very simple example. In my childhood, I used to know the phone numbers of all my friends. I don't know anybody's number now, including mine. I have to refer. So cognition, so this is the attention economy. And remember, data is a big player now, okay? And data becomes extremely crucial when you do research as well. And cognition in the attention economy is fast, emotional, all right? How quickly we like certain things, how quickly we respond to certain things. For example, the elephant, brutal death of an elephant in Kerala, attention grabbing, emotionally, how quickly emotionally charged we became. We didn't stop to think about the multiple dimensions of it. We did not know the elephant would have so much politics in her, but we immediately responded to this particular event. Such an information ecology is not perhaps conducive to deliberative thinking, long process of thought that goes into it, political participation. It is rather spontaneous. You look at it and you respond. You remember Wordsworth's spontaneous overflow of powerful emotions. That was not spontaneous at all. I mean, that comes under a completely different scenario. But to bring that here, you spontaneously respond to anything that you find on social media, because it just requires a tap of a finger. So information ecology has some very detrimental components. So you have people who see it as collaborative ignorance. People who have some glimmering of idea about something which has happened go online, very authoritatively comment, and if you are a person who has n number of followers, what you say will be accepted, what you say will be disseminated. Okay? But social media, and there is information overload. Social media is just a tool here. It is not necessarily ethical, and human beings will do what they want to do with it, for better or worse. So here I would like to I think I'm running short of time, but very quickly, literature and post-truth. That is something which we have to deal with when we teach literature, because we are always asked that we deal with imagination, which is nothing to do with truth. So wasn't literature always in the realm of post-truth? So there are some very, very interesting arguments here. All right. The sense of, let's look at a text, a literary text. The sense of urgency, not just a text, a movie perhaps, that a literary fiction can give, suggests that there is a deeper truth that lies hidden behind a singular narrative. And it leads us to believe it's not just me, it is happening to many other people. So there is a wider appeal that goes forth from this work that we are dealing with here is some kind of truth. All right? So, like you respond to it and you feel that, oh, there are people who think like me. So there is a collective, commonality here, a collective response here. And we feel that if many people think in the same manner, there must be something to it. It must be true. So this is what it means to live in common. And this is the commonality of art. Commonality is usually understood as something that is shared among the members of a community. And this is why literature has mass appeal. So let us look at how literature has been used to convey deliberate falsehoods. If you go back to Chaucer and Chaucer's Prioress Tale, this has a direct reference to the anti-Semitic discourse that you find very evidently in Shakespeare. It's going on in the Western culture for many, many years. So, Geoffrey Chaucer talks about, in the Prioress Tale, refers to a particular incident. In 1255, on the 29th of August, the body of a young English boy called Hugh was found in a well in the town of Lincoln. Rumors spread, and they said that he had been ritually, please mark the words, ritually murdered by the Jews. And the story grew with retelling. People said, oh, this is how they, how people talk. And Jews from throughout, the story only grew. And one of the very important chroniclers of English history talked about Jews throughout England who had gathered in Lincoln to fatten, torture, and crucify this child. 19 Jews were tried and executed for this murder. Similar blood libels became popular in other English towns, and there were a series of pogroms in which whole Jewish communities were massacred. And the story, and this is what you find in Chaucer's Prioress Tale also, and the tale culminates with the hanging of the Jews. And Hugh of Lincoln was buried in Lincoln Cathedral, and he was venerated as a saint. And they said that he would perform miracles. And his tomb continued to draw pilgrims. In 1955, 10 years after the Holocaust, Lincoln Cathedral repudiates the blood libel story, placing a plaque near Hugh's tomb, which now reads, trumped up stories of ritual murder by Jewish communities were common through Europe during the Middle Ages and even much later. So remember, but this story lasted from 1255 to 1955. So imagine, fake stories have a way of lingering. They don't actually leave us very quickly. So ancient religions, all religions have been used to use fiction to cement cooperation. All right, so, and I think it was Hitler who very succinctly put it, I just quote from him, in the Nazi propaganda maestro, he explained his method thus. That was Joseph Goebbels who said that, a lie once told remains a lie, but a lie told 1,000 times becomes a truth. Very, very relevant with social media. And Hitler wrote, the most brilliant propagandist technique will yield no success unless one fundamental principle is borne in mind. And what is that? This is propaganda. Stick to a few points, repeat them over and over. 2 or 3 points, repeat it in various modalities, various modes, and people will start believing it. So this is not something Facebook has created. This is not something the virtual world has created. This has been in existence from time immemorial, from the time we started using language, as I said. And that is why, I think Harari said that we are always been a post-truth species. There is no escape from that. Now, the next point that I would like to make is the concept of a text and the public ownership of a text. And this has got to do a little bit of post-truth along with multiple other dimensions of reading as well. Here, the honesty of an author, where, the idea of plagiarism, and this is not for the research scholars to take it to heart. I'm not talking about plagiarism and research here. I'm talking about the skills of writing. Okay, we'll begin with the author. The author may refuse to engage with political issues, but what still remains as a matter of political commitment that the writer takes ownership over a narrative that is now out there in the community, where it will impact its readers to a greater or lesser extent. So this is the idea. So perhaps Shakespeare or perhaps Salman Rushdie did not want to engage with a particular political issue, all right? But still, they are the ones who have written the text. But once the text is out, it is disseminated, and there is argument about this, debate over it, public ownership is to be borne by the author. And that is the paradox of public ownership. The author cannot retract her work. She can't take it back. It is already there out in the public domain. She does not own it in that sense. You get it? So this is something that has gone out of my hand. Though I have written it, I can no longer take it back. So I own it, and I yet do not own it. So once the narrative is made public, she will nevertheless have to take some responsibility for it. She will have to own it, as they say. So this is another dimension of the commonality of art. So that please remember that these are just minor points that I'm giving you. You can read extensively about all this. I just wanted to sort of bring in a couple of ideas so that research will be more fruitful. And I would like to talk about one text written by Marjorie Perloff. It's called Unoriginal Genius. So Perloff begins by rooting her investigation in the work of T.S. Eliot. So Perloff actually taught the unoriginal genius means where people don't actually, what do I say? It's not their original work. And you have very interesting writers like Christian Bock. Christian Bock actually, there's an experiment that he was doing, feeding certain what do I say? In the form of into the bacteria, certain letters in the form by bacteria, and the bacteria would release a code, and based on that you would write a poem. If you just Google Christian Bock, BOK, you will find it. Marjorie Perloff, very surprisingly, doesn't use Christian Bock. She uses Wasteland. And Wasteland, says Perloff, remains, which is Eliot's very celebrated poem, and he gives us the immediacy of borrowed lines. So if you look at Wasteland, and supposing you put Wasteland as a hypertext, you will find that there are multiple links, there are hyperlinks, n number of hyperlinks in Wasteland. So that is why Perloff calls Eliot a non-original genius. But Eliot doesn't have any qualms about it being a plagiarized work. Eliot was performing what modernism was talking about, that the author is merely a catalyst. So what is enduring about the Wasteland is it affords a special textual pleasure on account of its citational quality. And this is what we find in contemporary appropriation works, a kind of literary effect that is neither confessional nor dry. So it is a liminal space that we occupy, both within the domain of language and within the domain of experiences, where writers very openly take or borrow or use other material, recycle it, and like all authors are merely conduits. So who is an original genius is what Marjorie Perloff is going to ask here. So this is where you move from the information age to the age of experience. The density of the web environment in the contemporary media landscape results in intense and incessant competition for attention. So media environment is characterized by abundance, by interactivity, mobility, and it is characterized by high velocity and dizzying excess. So there is no time to verify or to think. You just go. And another thing that I would like to tell you here is that this is where the idea of reading also changes. when you play games, okay? So let's sort of trace a trajectory of how the reader has changed. You have Aristotle who told you about catharsis, where we identify and we purge our excess emotions and all that. And then we moved on in the structuralist regimes to the defamiliarization. You have Brecht and Beckett who spoke of the alienation effect, whereby you're made to feel at every point of time, look, this is a play, don't identify it. Why did they do that? They did not want you to identify with a materialist capitalist culture that was pulling you in, sucking into a very vortex and talking about what the reality they created as the reality. So they wanted to disturb that sort of accepting complacency. So you have the alienation effect. Now you move on to something called immersion effect. Because when you're playing a game, you choose a particular avatar and you're playing using that avatar, using that icon, and somewhere you become that. So there is no separation of you from the avatar. And the idea of the reader has slowly but subtly changed from catharsis to alienation to immersion. And with this, like I said, a dizzying velocity of multiple information challenges. And coming back to this, due to the onslaught of information, audiences have become impatient. And then they don't want long reasoned arguments for truth claims. Instead, they want instant gratification of feeling as knowing. So that boundary is blurred. What you feel is what you respond to, and that is what you know, and that is what you think is right. And that is exactly why post-truth becomes very closely connected to media technology in the present time. And before I wind up, we spoke about post-truth in relation to literature. Now, finally, one more area, which is nationalism. And you have Benedict Anderson, who says that nationalism is nothing but an imagined community. And this becomes a modular idea. And why? Because it can be translated and transplanted to different geographical, social terrains. And it merges and it is merged with correspondingly wide variety of political and ideological constellations. So this is where post-truth comes in the area of nationalism also, because you are made to believe in this geographical area having the emotional impact on you and the sense of belonging that space gives you. And the political ramifications is it. We can have a particular attachment to a nationality, to a nation, and we also realize how historically arbitrary and intellectually meager the phenomenon of nationalism is really. But we sort of accept it because, like I told you, this is something which has been circulating. Yeah, I don't know if I have the time. Can you tell me? Yeah, within the frame, so we've moved from post-feminism and post-truth. I would like to sort of touch upon something called chaos theory. And why I would like to talk about chaos theory is that you move on into an area where multiple disciplines are brought in, right? And physics is also brought in, and it is within physics that you find this great concern about the tools of analysis and self-reflexivity of the tools which are used to analyze the object itself. So chaos theory was first done by a meteorologist. The real experiment happened in 1960 by Edward Lawrence. He was working with a system of equations to predict what the weather would be like. So chaos theory was devised to deal with the dynamics of non-linear systems. And this is where chaos theory becomes very closely connected with the idea of literature and with the idea of deconstruction. All right. So, and this is where the famous butterfly effect comes in, because chaos theory finds that certain phenomena is very sensitive to even small fluctuations in their initial conditions. So how it started has a very great impact on what it is now. So the cultural situation in which a particular text is constructed and disseminated has a lot to do with how we see the text now. You look at Shakespeare, you look at Chaucer, very clearly understood. And you ought to also, within the framework of chaos theory and the nonlinear effect, look at the English literature syllabus that you are studying. It is very crucial. You have to look at your own tools of analysis. You know, I feel very, very sorry because you cannot teach a text which has immediate relevance to our culture, to the lived life experiences that we are undergoing. Instead, we sort of still talk about Kate Millett and Simone de Beauvoir as far as feminism is concerned. We have trailblazing feminists in Kerala as well. We have, I don't know how many of us have even heard about women's movements in Kerala. So I think any type of syllabi should ought to contain regional concepts or regional movements, regional activism. So let's come back to chaos theory. In chaotic systems, there are two things which are important. One is randomness and one is determinism. This is what Milton was also bothered about in Paradise Lost. Was it just random that Eve ate the apple, or was it predetermined? If it is predetermined, then who do you blame? Can we be held responsible for anything that we are doing? Or is it just random? It happens. In which case, many other ideologies will be in trouble. So it leads to the counterintuitive conclusion that they are simultaneously predictable and unpredictable in their operation. The very simple example is you shoot an arrow, you're a very good maths person, but 99.9% your arrow will hit bullseye. But there's a chance that a strong wind might deflect the arrow. So the intermingling of randomness as well as determinism within the same system is what chaos theory is talking about. So natural systems, they're talking about the weather, are controlled by mysterious forces called strange attractors. They are simultaneously random and determined, and strange attractors determine what happens within each system. So they are the trajectory towards which all other trajectories converge, and they are inexorable in their operation. So this is the scientific understanding of chaos theory. And literary discussion with foreground chaos theory focus on the relationship between the individual mind and what surrounds it, whether text or other beings, fictional or real. Let's bring Shakespeare into it once more. Like we said, a character is a particular plateau in which several cultural discourses are meshing together at a certain point of time. Then we will have to look at Shakespeare's contemporaries as well, in which case we have to ask ourselves, if everybody has heard of Shakespeare, why haven't they heard of their contemporaries? Why has that dissemination not happened? So, there is a very seminal text called Noise of Culture, written by Paulson, and he argues that literature is equivalent to chaos theory in its ability to examine and explain chaotic phenomena. So, life is chaotic, and literature tries to make sense of what is chaotic within life. So, implicit in this claim is the idea that fictional worlds are as important as the real world and as worthy of study. Now, why is that so? It is so because it is a human endeavor to explain what are myths. Myths were ancient human beings' endeavor to explain to ourselves what life was all about. In much the same way, fiction is a human being's endeavor from a very subjective perspective to look at the cultural political discourses around her and to frame an understanding of what the world is all about. Therefore, fictional worlds are given as important as real worlds which are worthy of study. So another important thinker in the world of chaos theory is Katherine Hayes. So she attempts to establish a parallel between chaos theory and various philosophical post-structuralist positions, including Derrida and Foucault, claiming that chaos may be on par with evolution, relativity, and quantum mechanics on its impact on culture. And also Damascus, who tells us that chaos theory can help in comprehending several paths that the theatre has followed since the inception of postmodernism. So, chaos science and Derridian deconstruction, according to Katherine Hayes, resemble each other. For Hayes, Derrida attempts to undermine the very process by which meaning is constituted. So, the idea of evolution, the etymology of words, which is extremely problematized. And there is a parallel between deconstruction and non-linear dynamics. They agree that bounded deterministic systems can be chaotic. They both employ iteration and emphasize iteration, repetition in various forms, and folds, F-O-L-D-S. They can concur that originary or initial conditions cannot be specified exactly. Now, what is the point in bringing in chaos theory here? Because chaos theory, rooted in the realm of physics, can be used to understand something which was based on conceptual thought, not experimental thought. All right, so this is how it works. So, we spoke about iteration, and iteration is used to get closer to a solution. not to create temporary solution. Therefore, it keeps on repeating itself. And what is a fold? In deconstruction, the fold in a text is that term which can be used to break down the binary distinction which the text presupposes. It is a pressure point for interpretive message. Folds create the illusion of the origin, and we can dispel the illusion by exposing the fold. Folding is also relevant to chaos theory. The infinitely fine structure of strange attractors can be seen as the limit of a countless number of abstract topological folding operations. So this is where the dismantling comes in, where you look at the basic binary, the basic split, and you sort of build in that space, and that space is known as a fold. Let me give you an example. I'm sure all of you must have read Waiting for Godot, written by Samuel Beckett. And if you look at it, there are many binaries which are being dismantled here. And the idea of the center, the self-reflexive center that exists outside the text is what Derrida was talking about. What is the center in Beckett's play? If you look at it in one way, one center in the play is Godot. We do not know what Godot or who Godot is. And Godot never enters the text, but Godot is always there, a constant point of reference to the text. And the presence of Godot actually enhances the binaries within the text. And if Godot is removed, the waiting stops, the playing stops, and endless play of signifiers emerge. So this idea of the breaking of the binary is the point at which the fold is situated. This fold is also present in chaos theory. So this is one of the main geometrical features of strange attractors, a combination of stretching and folding. The action of a chaotic system will take nearby points, stretch them in certain directions, creating local divergence responsible for unpredictability. Remember, it's about the weather. Look at the way the cyclones are predicted. But sometimes when they reach a particular area, the initial prediction is not fulfilled. Sometimes it goes in excess. So the system acts to fold together points that are at some distance, causing a convergence of trajectories in a different direction. So this is where both randomness as well as determinism happens. Look at the trajectory of a hurricane, how the weather forecasters predicted based on how the hurricane is evolving, based on their knowledge of how the hurricane is evolving. But as a hurricane moves into different local areas, different regions, the trajectory becomes different. So chaos theory and modern critical theory, there are a couple of common points. So, and it would be impossible for chaos theory, it's not impossible for chaos theory to play a role in the interpretation of literary work. For example, if a novel were explicitly and intentionally constructed to demonstrate a parallel between psychological relation between its characters and properties of chaotic system, then chaos theory would help us learn much about the work. At the very least, it's clear that chaos is not a general principle for the understanding and interpretation of literature, but we have to understand that it is very liminal, it is very contingent, and it depends upon multiple spaces into which this text has traveled. Again, if you, for an example, I'm using Shakespeare because I'm sure the Bard is read by everybody. And if you look at Hamlet, and you look at the psychoanalytic ramifications in Hamlet, and then you look at very close to the text itself, and the randomness and determinism within it, and the psychosexual tensions within it, we understand that all characters are studies and obsessions. Sometimes very explicitly, but sometimes implicit obsessions are there. Wherever you care to look at Hamlet, you will find this. You have Hamlet's uncle's obsession with drink, and Hamlet sees his mother's obsession with sexual gratification, Ophelia's obsession with remaining pure, Polonia's obsession with what is right and what is wrong. So there is a multiple study of obsessions here, again based on the idea of what it was to be mad and what it was not to be married within the context of Elizabethan England. And quite brilliantly, at the end of the play, Shakespeare selects, or Hamlet says, Fortinbras will rule Denmark. If you go back into the etymology of the word Fortinbras, it meant strong of arm. So perhaps what was needed then was not too much of intellectual density, but a person who could act at the point when it was required of him to act. So this is how you use the general principles of randomness and determinism in order to understand a particular text. Okay, very briefly on memory. So, like I told you, the idea of memory itself undergoing a huge sea change based on technology, because different ways in which memory is played. And if you look at it, the archives, archives and museums are places where memory is stored in a concrete form. What type of memories are stored there? You find mostly, you look at in a museum, you will find the robes worn by kings, the swords used by them. Very rarely would you find a history of cooking in a museum. What were the tools that women used to cook? Gender museums are not a done thing, are they? So literature hopes to capture these repressed or dying out memories. And one way to do it is in a way of writing novels. A greater experiment, a very stunning experiment was done by Svetlana Alexievich in her second-hand time, and she talks about the Soviet Union, the dismantling of the Soviet Union, the communist regime. And what she does is she goes into the midst of people and she interviews them. She gathers hundreds of interviews and she puts it together in the form of a book. It is an enlightening experience to read such books, because you understand that one event is conceptualized, is remembered, is thought of in multiple ways, and whose memory is right, whose memory is wrong. We are not anybody to comment on that. All we are left with is this bewildering array of different ideas about the same event. And that is where technology and memory are, sort of fighting with each other, because the quicker a vision disappears from you, the quicker it is erased from your mind. And if technology can be used to store memory, addictive use of technology leads you to forget more than you remember. So we see memory as a fragmentary personal representation of historical material. So this is what Svetlana Alexievich was doing. Murakami also does it with a particular terrorist attack that happened. And it might be seen as a reaction to, so this is what Assmann has to say, he's a very important writer as far as memory studies are concerned, the reaction to the ephemerality and the historicity of popular culture to reclaim the past as an indispensable part of the present. So the unlimited capacity for the storage of visual oral memory has created a preoccupation with the production of memory. And media and memory will do this. So digital literature, again, allows for a meta-reflection on the role of media and technology and its power to store and endlessly reproduce optical visual data. So there is a work called Screen, and if you just Google it, you will find that. It is an interactive work in which memories disappear as the reader, or the player, you would say, attempts to make them last longer. And well, I'm going to wind up now. Before winding up, just a word more on posthumanism, because it's spoken about many sort of posts. And the never the beginning. One important evolution that has happened is the concept of the posthuman. You have posthumanism as well as transhumanism. So transhumanism is where the man and the machine, the human being and the machine combine. And posthumanism is an abstract ideology which brings into its ambit anything and everything concerned with life on the surface of the earth. And it can be a virus, it can be an animal, it can be plants, because it is symbiotic, it is interconnected. And the discourse of humanism is quite strongly challenged, because who was a human according to the modernist Enlightenment outlook in the Western Hemisphere? Human was the white man. Neither you nor I, we are watching this from a country like India, we were not considered human. We were not part of the Enlightenment production. Enlightenment was all about slavery, if you look at it from that angle. So posthumanism challenges this idea of what it is to be human, and it sort of tells you that you cannot place the human on the top of the food chain. You cannot place a human on a pedestal. The human is only one strand. This is where deep ecology comes in as well. The human is merely one strand in multiple strands of life. But what it takes in, apart from the ecological idea of life, is the concept of technology, because technology is not just a tool. Technology is has become like language to us. It is technology which helps us to look at ourselves, to understand ourselves, and to reconceptualize ourselves. So if we have thought of ourselves as a linguistic animal, we have to talk about ourselves as technological animals as well. And that is where post-humanism has a huge role to play. And that is where the idea of nomadic theory comes in, along with actor network theory brought in by Bruno Latour. I'm just talking about it so that research scholars can go and search and find out. I will be talking about nomadic theory in later sessions in other colleges, but just for the time being, this is the takeoff of nomadic theory. Thank you very much for your patient listening. I hope it was useful. I would welcome questions.
Participants, if you have any questions, you may ask. Any questions? Ma'am, we got a question. Shall I read it for you?
Please read it out.
From one Manjeet Singh, the performance of real has affected the true real. If that may have some root for the post-truth, post-theory scenario. Is it clear, ma'am?
Yeah, the question, you have read it very clearly. For me, the question is, what is really? Your idea of the real, the actual, and the virtual. And what happens is that, supposing I am sitting here and talking to you, it's a mixture of the actual and the virtual, isn't it? But if you are, the real and the virtual, it's a mixture of the real and the virtual. But if you are sitting here or sitting in a classroom physically, but you're thinking about something else, that is your actual world at that point of time. So the real is always a mixture of the real and the actual. What is real for me might not be real for you from another perspective, because my conditioning, my understanding, my political perspectives, my condition might color my understanding of the real. And that is why one event is multiply interpreted. I hope it is clear.
Ma'am, there is another question from Nirmetita. Can transhumanism come of genetic engineering and by cyborgs? Was it clear, ma'am?
Yeah, transhumanism is a part of
genetic engineering and by cyborgs.
Yeah, definitely. And you don't need to go so deeply into genetic engineering or DNA manipulation. All of us are cyborgs. I'm sitting here talking to you through this platform. I am a cyborg. All of us are cyborgs, and all of us are part of this technological evolution that is going on, definitely changing our idea of what it is to be human.
Good afternoon, ma'am. I have one question.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you if we can consider Black feminism as a post-theory.
Yeah, depending on where it is articulated from.
Right.
And because Black feminism has multiple dimensions. What type of Blacks are you talking about? Are you talking about Blacks living in America or Blacks living in Africa? They have very different socio-political experiences. So that is where I have a problem with blanket terms, right? How do you manage that? Post-colonialism again becomes a blanket term. Feminism becomes a blanket term. So post-theory is always all about reinventing these blanket terms, dismantling the meta-narratives and looking at petit narratives. A petit research means minor narratives. Looking at minor narratives, your narrative, my narrative cannot be brought under the blanket term of feminism, because we may not agree with many of the ideologies that Simone de Beauvoir or many of those Anglo-centric feminists have to say. So we have to devise our own ideas.
So how do we think that in modalities in that hierarchization of literature?
Always remember, the academy is an institution. All right, very, very established institution, and unless and until we go on iteration, go on talking about it, go on telling them, look, life has changed, they will still stick to, their idea of theory will end with Derrida. Okay, if you look at the syllabus, that's where it ends, doesn't it? Yes. So what do we do with Zizek? What do we do with Deleuze? What do we do with Bruno Latour and Rose Bradotti? Because they are writing, and what they are writing is very relevant for us. And popular fiction is definitely part of our culture. Look at the way Manichitra Thaler has been conceived. I don't know if there are non-Malayalis here, but just to highlight an example about popular text, you can very clearly apply the idea of mad woman in the attic to Manichitra Thaler. It's a study of madness and women. So you can bring in psychiatry into it, not the kind of patriarchal psychiatry that was brought in by the author and the filmmaker, but otherwise. So popular, like I told you, popular fiction, popular writing is definitely part of us, part of our reality. And what is popular? I mean, that is another question altogether. If it is easily readable, does it become popular? And Chetan Bhagat ought to be researched into. I think, why does he have such a great impact, the socio-political desperation of reading Chetan Bhagat? Why is that? And remember, Shakespeare was a popular writer. He was not one of the university wits. So your idea of what it is elite to be elite and what it is to be popular will undergo a change. Like Foucault said, it will change. So who am I as an academic to say that you can't do research on it? If your tools of analysis and your hypothesis is proper, you can analyze any single thing. You should analyze Fort Cochin. You should analyze the installations that happen there because those are ergodic texts. Look at the installations that happen in Fort Cochin. You have to get inside the installation to understand it. And for the third person looking at it, I'm the part of the installation as well. So physical involvement of the reader is involved. This is an extremely new area. What are we supposed to do? Read Chess of the D'Urbervilles over and over again? That is absurd.
Hello, ma'am.
Yeah.
Shall we go for winding?
Yes. Thank you.
Okay, ma'am. So thank you, ma'am, for a very much enlightening and the brilliant session. And from the bottom of our heart, we thank you.
I hope it was useful.
Plenty. You should go through the chat. It's like pouring in.
Thank you so much for your patient listening. Somebody was asking me about spatial theory. I don't have time to address it now, but perhaps I could speak about it sometime later.
Okay, ma'am. We look forward for that. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much.